1906. In 1906, this was a small mill town in the heavy woolen district of Yorkshire, and most of the people who lived here lived in small, back-to-back terrace houses. It's a measure of the strength of the temperance movement at that time that this small town built this large hall dedicated to the defeat of the demon drink. When these people were children, they were all members of the Band of Hope, which was the children's section of the temperance movement. Now, let me try and give you some idea of what this mass movement really meant. In 1901, there were 29,000 Bands of Hope. That's one for every 4 pubs, and 3.5 million children were members. And in those days, the Salvation Army and the various temperance organizations were incredibly active, incredibly dedicated, because in the poverty-ridden and overcrowded conditions of late Victorian times, drunkenness was all too visible.
Oh, drink, it was ruination, really. I have none when my days, because they didn't know when to stop.
And you could go in and have a tot of rum for 2pence and a glass of beer for about a penny. And the Upton, I remember them telling me when I was a youngster that some of the men never got to work. They'd be in the pubs all day.
Public houses then, they opened at 6 in the morning and finished at 11 at night. Well, of course, they'd go, as soon as they got their wages, they'd bob into pub, and that was it. The wages had gone. No wages to take home. So, really, I don't know how they did get through. I don't know. It must have been terrible for the wives.
I used to wait outside of my husband, and he was a civil servant, but I could never catch him. He always found a way out, and I never saw that money, because he'd drink it.
The Salvation Army came to the end of the street, and then, of course, everybody used to crowd round, and then they'd be singing, reforming everybody, you see, especially the drunks. Well, of course, the drunks really enjoyed it. They used to come out of the pubs, you know, to join in singing. And then while they were there, you know, they'd have sort of a campaign that there was saving the souls, you know. And of course, if they could get one to join the Salvation Army, well, he was a soul saved.
Although alcohol affects all classes, it was in the working class that it was most visible, and therefore the campaigns were waged against their drinking, comparing the poverty of the drinker's family with the almost middle-class respectability of temperance. The movement campaigned for more licensing laws, and the advent of war in 1914 gave their cause added impetus. In March 1915, the Shipbuilding Employers Federation, none of whose members were teetotalers, asked the government to severely restrict the sale of intoxicating drink for the duration of the war, producing evidence that the grave loss of production in the industry was due to drink. Lloyd George's response was eloquent.
We are fighting Germany, Austria, and the drink. And as far as I can see, the greatest of these deadly foes is drink.
Lead not to temptation, or in sin.
The campaign gathered force and was widely reported, so that it became a major issue on the home front. As the campaign moved towards legislation, the Morning Advertiser, the paper of the licensed trade, fought back with public meetings. Then, as now, they tried to argue that alcohol abuse was up to the individual and not the drug's availability. They even claimed beer was a temperance drink. But the writing was on the wall. Lord Kitchener appealed to everyone to avoid treating soldiers to drink so they would be able to do their duty to their country in a thoroughly efficient manner. The King announced that there would be no drink served in the royal household for the duration. Whether or not barley water really did replace liquor in the households of the gentry, or was just part of the newspaper's patriotic campaign, there can be no doubt that the mood had changed. The brewers made a last-ditch attempt to rouse the drinking masses, but in Parliament, the majority was in favour of control. By the end of 1915, the legislation to control consumption was enacted and a central control board was set up. These measures were effective in controlling the abuse of alcohol. By the end of the war, licensing hours had been cut from round about 16 hours a day to 5.5 hours a day in pubs and clubs and 4.5 hours a day in off-licenses. Alcohol consumption had been cut in half, and drunkenness offences had been cut to 1/6 of what they'd been before the war. But most important of all, it had been accepted that the government could intervene in the running of the alcohol industry. And many of the controls that were introduced were retained after the war, right up to the present day, because common sense told everybody that the lower the level of alcohol consumption, the lower the level of alcohol abuse. But then, in 1919, America went one step further. These are the familiar images of prohibition, made even more familiar by the countless movies of the 1930s.
You haven't got a chance. Come on with your hands up.
All right, say, Rick, a little safer, that's all. You got a drink in the house?
Well, not before breakfast, dear.
Oh, I'm just wild about Harry, and he's...
They were all great films with great stars. But how much did all this reflect the reality of America in the 1920s? A Californian researcher, Robin Room, has been reassessing the facts about prohibition and the legacy which it handed on to the next generation. Of course, all my ideas about prohibition derived from the movies I saw in adolescence. And looking at those, it gave the impression that prohibition lasted a very short time, was a disastrous experiment in that it made people drink more, and it had to be given up because of organized crime growing and getting out of hand.
Well, I think it's important to see that the movies that we see and the image of prohibition as presented in the movies is an image looking back from the 30s, and it's an image of a middle-class generation that revolted against prohibition. The generation of the Flappers, the generation of college students at the end of prohibition, really revolted against it, and they went on to write the novels and make the movies that form our image of prohibition. Prohibition lasted from 1919 to 1934, so it was really quite an extended period of time, and was initially quite popular. It was passed during wartime, it's true, but the majority in favor of prohibition rose in Congress in the elections immediately after prohibition was brought in. In the early years of prohibition, it's estimated that the consumption of alcohol in the country actually fell to 1/3 of what it had been before prohibition.
Did this have any effect on people's health?
Well, the cirrhosis mortality dropped, the folk in mental hospitals with a diagnosis of alcoholic psychosis fell off, so that the best estimates we have is it had a substantial effect. The other thing is that it did create an enormous market. There were still people who were going to drink anyway, and it created an enormous market which was filled by people who were then acting against the law, and who tended to get better organized as time went on. So there is something to the image of prohibition that reflects some reality. It was a great fillip to organized crime of the big cities,
The most powerful man in the underworld is Scarface Al Capone. Now barely 30, he controls policemen, judges, and mayors, and he openly runs a vast network of bootlegging, gambling, protection, and vice. His annual revenue is reported at over 100 million. Violence is the foundation of Capone's kingdom. His gangland rivals are machine-gunned in broad daylight. And during the Prohibition era, more than 500 Chicago gangsters are slain by their own kind.
By the end of Prohibition, the big industrialists had turned against Prohibition. Many of them had been in favor of Prohibition because they thought it would lead to a better disciplined workforce and make for greater profits. By the end of Prohibition, they saw the lawlessness as really threatening the legal order in the U.S., and they turned against Prohibition and, in fact, helped finance the American Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, which was the main political organization for defeating it.
The greatest drought in the history of the world is at an end. With a Hey 99 and a Hot Shot Shaw, the native daughters welcome the gin that looks like water but kicks like a mule back to the shores of California. And so to New Orleans, the home of the Ramos Gin Fizz, the place where no one has ever been known to order a fourth Sazerac cocktail because he couldn't say Sazerac after the third one. Meanwhile, at a meeting at Jamestown, New York, the Women's Christian Temperance Union fights on. Mrs. Florence Mitchell of Elmira voices the Lady Dry's war cry.
The repeal of the 18th Amendment means the coming back of the old-time saloon by whatever name we call it. Woe to that nation that sacrifices its little children for the sake of filling its coffers with gold.
New York celebrates. For the first time since that bleak January morning 14 years ago when the great drought struck the big town, the Gay White Way is itself again. The greatest amusement center comes into its own.
It's a kind of conversation stopper and thought stopper, not only for alcohol, but for a number of other issues, to say, well, laws have no effect on people. Look at what happened to Prohibition in America, with Prohibition in America. And so that the argument that Prohibition was a failure and that is not only deeply entrenched in our thought, it also becomes so much a cultural shibboleth that you don't have to think any further. Prohibition in some terms was not a failure. In political terms, it was definitely in the long run a failure. You could argue that in cultural terms, it was also in the long run a failure. But it did have a positive influence on the health of the people.
Did Prohibition and all that happened around Prohibition have an effect on our thinking about alcohol afterwards?
The political failure of it, that is, the debacle where it was repealed, produced a situation where no politician wanted to talk about alcohol again. And the whole issue of alcohol was taken off the political agenda. The compromise essentially was to say we're going to treat this as a private behavior.
In fact, they brought doctors into it, didn't they? Made it a medical problem.
Well, you have to see the alcoholism movement as emerging in the 30s and 40s out of that vacuum in which it was not acceptable to talk about alcohol problems at all in the society. And the disease concept of alcoholism, the idea that there was some predisposing factor that made certain individuals unable to tolerate drink while everyone else's drinking could be left alone, was in a way the only politically acceptable way in which you could talk about alcohol problems. The hidden message behind the disease concept was, I'm not going to interfere with your drinking, I'm only talking about these special problem cases over here.
Prohibition left us with this powerful legacy, a myth that many people believe today. Before Prohibition, we accepted that the demon of alcohol was in the bottle, in the alcohol. After Prohibition, it became difficult to blame the drug itself, and the emphasis changed to the wayward individual. Individuals who suffered a disease called alcoholism. It's no coincidence that 3 years after Prohibition ended, Alcoholics Anonymous was born in Ohio, USA.
we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable.
Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him.
Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves.
AA sees the alcoholic not as a victim of society's use of alcohol, but as someone who suffers from a personal disease that prevents him or her drinking sensibly. The only cure is total abstinence. As a refuge and salvation for those who've hit rock bottom, AA has no equal in its scale and availability. Many people owe their lives to it. But the theory of alcoholism became not just a popular concept, but the accepted medical view. When I was a medical student in the late 1940s, we weren't taught anything about alcohol abuse. You didn't really need a doctor to recognize an alcoholic, and there was only one form of treatment. You either stopped drinking or you died. The Maudsley Hospital is Britain's premier psychiatric hospital, but even here in the 1950s, very little interest was taken in the causes of alcohol abuse. However, one psychiatrist became convinced that the disease concept was too simplistic. In 1962, D.L. Davis reported in a relatively obscure medical journal that 7 previously alcoholic patients had become normal social drinkers. This short paper created a near revolution in the small world of alcohol studies and ultimately led to a complete reappraisal of the factors which create alcohol problems. Dr. Robin Murray now holds the post which D.L. Davis held for many years. He remembers how Davis changed the emphasis in alcohol research.
Several research groups started really trying to take Davis's views further, and in came the view that perhaps you should assess a controlled drinking in alcoholics. If some alcoholics could return to controlled drinking even when their doctors told them it was impossible, was it possible that you could then teach alcoholics to drink in a more normal fashion? So there's been that one line of research, and I think the other line of research that Davis particularly fostered was the idea that social and economic forces are important, that you cannot just adopt a medical model, that there's no use just building more and more alcohol units for treatment. It's just as silly as training more and more surgeons to chop out lung cancers. You can never catch up with the number of lung cancers that cigarettes are causing. Similarly, as long as people drink more and more alcohol, you'll never be able to provide enough psychiatrists, social workers, nurses to treat their alcoholism. So he emphasized both the option of controlled drinking and also the emphasis on a social and economic, political model of alcoholism as well as a medical model.
The social model of alcohol abuse links it directly with the supply of alcohol and its consumption by the population as a whole, not just by some genetically programmed or sick people. Professor Bob Kendall of the Royal Edinburgh Hospital has been chairman of a World Health Organization committee on alcohol problems.
Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1970s, alcohol consumption was rising fast throughout the world. It doubled in this country, and it doubled in most other countries as well. It became clear, as this was happening, that all the ill effects, deaths from cirrhosis, deaths from cancer of the gullet, hospital admissions for alcoholism, convictions for public drunkenness, drunk driving offences, were all going up inexorably as general population consumption went up. And then when we look back to the earlier records of what had happened in the early years of the century, when consumption was falling, as it did very substantially between the Edwardian era and the mid-1930s, it became clear that as consumption had fallen in that era, all these ill effects had fallen steadily then. In this country, the death rate directly attributable to alcohol fell by over 75% between 1905 and 1935. And in fact, it is now clear in this country and in every other country that is capable of producing adequate statistics that there's a remarkably close relationship between the total quantity which the nation drinks which includes, of course, your drinking and my drinking, and all the ill effects, or at least all the readily measurable ill effects.
So alcohol abuse can be linked directly with total alcohol consumption, and in Britain consumption went up as alcohol got cheaper. In 1938, a bottle of whiskey cost the equivalent of 62 new pence. That was 8.5 hours' work on a manual worker's wages. By 1960, he earned a bottle of whiskey in just over 6 hours. But by 1976, it only took him 2.5 hours to buy the same amount of whiskey. And the real price of beer has gone much the same way. In 1938, 24 minutes earned a pint of draft. In 1960, it was down to 12 minutes. And in 1976, just 9 minutes work per pint. Compare that with a loaf of bread, which was earned in 9 minutes in 1950, but 11 minutes in 1976. And the effect of these price changes and increased consumption has been reflected in our high streets, particularly in the last 10 years. This shop used to be an off-licence, but it closed down a few years ago, possibly because of the close proximity of the funeral director. But this is an exception to the general rule. When this shop was open, the alcohol outlets in this street were 3 pubs, just serving a small local clientele, the British Legion Club, and 2 restaurants, 1 Greek and 1 Italian, which served drinks with meals. Now the scene is quite changed. First, the pubs have been spruced up. The biggest has gone for the young singles market, and the other 2 have been redecorated and offer entertainment and food. But they've been joined by 2 wine bars, one occupying what used to be the biggest butcher's in town. A former delicatessen specializing in tea and coffee is now part of an off-license chain. And there are 3 more restaurants, all with licenses, and one has a separate cocktail bar. Now, as if that isn't enough, this grocer's, which is midway between a pub and a wine bar, has recently been given an off-license. The hi-fi shops, the boutiques, the building societies, the opticians and the chemists haven't yet got licenses, but the trend is fairly clear. Now, are these new outlets a response to a market, or are they creating markets of their own? Each of them had to apply for planning permission from the council and had to get a license from local magistrates. Now, society seems to be saying officially that either there is no connection between the number of outlets and the problem of alcohol abuse, or if there is a connection, then it's one we needn't be worried about.
Many things influence government's thinking. Alcohol is a major industry. It's a major employer. It's a very important export industry. And of course, the taxation revenue from alcoholic drinks is a very important source of government revenue. And understandably, not want to see that reduced, not want to see that industry damaged, not to want to see those exports damaged. But of course, the consequence of allowing the